statements by President Biden, by Secretary Blinken, criticizing Israel, urging them not to do a ground offensive in Rafah. And this latest report suggesting that Israel may have violated international law are all part of that effort to heap more criticism and pressure on Israel so that Israel will do what the U.S. hopes it will do, which is to have a much more limited strike on Rafah that doesn't include a major ground offensive that's going to cause major humanitarian issues and exploit further the situation for civilians inside Gaza, hundreds of thousands of which fled northern Gaza into southern Gaza and into Rafah, which is why this really complicates the humanitarian situation.
Absolutely, David. Well, in a pre-recorded interview that aired Thursday, Dr. Phil sat down with Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister, who said he vows that Israel will fight with its fingernails if needed, essentially saying that the pause in U.S. shipments of military weapons won't stop them from continuing its operations in Gaza. What diplomatic steps do you believe are necessary to address the apparent disconnect between the U.S. and Israel at this point?
Well, that's what Netanyahu is saying publicly. But privately, the pressure the U.S. is putting on Israel is likely causing them to reconsider exactly how they're going to do this offensive action against Gaza and Rafah in particular. Netanyahu has been consistent in saying they have to do an action in Rafah. There is some basis for them to need to do some raids into Rafah because there likely are Hamas militants in Rafah, and there likely are also weapons depots in Rafah that they need to get to in order to complete their mission. But where the U.S. and Israel disagree is that Israel is saying they need to do a full ground offensive and occupy Rafah, and the U.S. would rather they do surgical strikes and limited, special operations raids into Rafah. And this is where there's a lot of disagreement. I think Israel will come a little bit further towards the U.S., but I do believe Netanyahu is going to go forward with some sort of ground offensive in Rafah, and we'll see how it works out. I think what's important for the Biden administration is to get on the other side of this Rafah situation. The U.S. has made it clear now that we disagree with the offensive ground action into Rafah that seems to be impending. But on the other side of it, what the U.S. is hopeful for is that once Israel completes whatever it is going to do in Rafah, we can actually move back towards ceasefire talks. And the Biden administration should be hoping for a very quick resumption of those talks and hopefully a permanent ceasefire and a release of hostages.
Well, David, we do know, speaking of that release of hostages, ceasefire, that aid groups have been evacuating out of Rafah ahead of this potential Rafah ground assault. What role can the U.S. play in protecting the well-being and safety of people there, if any?
Well, the U.S. obviously has the most influence with Israel, and certainly the U.S. and Israel share intelligence, and the U.S. has an obligation to inform Israel about any aid groups or international groups that are inside Rafah that it knows of that are potentially going to be caught in the crossfire. And that's part of what the U.S. is doing. But we don't have a presence in Rafah. We don't have any kind of military or diplomatic presence inside Gaza. So there's little else we can do other than make urgent requests, demands, and notifications to the government of Israel and to the Israeli Defense Forces.
All right, David Tafuri, former foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us this morning.